I want this wide board and I want this narrow board to come together seamlessly into a 120-degree corner. How do we do this? The first thing we need to do is cut the ends of both boards to 120 degrees, the same angle as the corner. Now I know that a regular square cut on my miter saw is 90 degrees despite my miter gauge reading 0. So I'm going to swing the blade to the right an additional 30 degrees from that 90, because 90 plus 30 more equals 120, and I'll make a note of what the gauge says for later use. With my two boards cut, I can flush the edge of the narrow piece to the freshly cut end of the wide piece and make a mark on the acute edge of that wide piece, telling me just how wide that narrow piece actually is. Now I can connect the mark I just made with the obtuse corner and scribe a line between the two and then head back to the saw. Before I make the cut though, I want to make sure that I clamp or tape down the wide board to the part of the table that doesn't rotate. That way, once I make the cut, I can swing the blade back to the original position without moving the wide piece. So after I make the cut, I swing the saw back to my 120-degree mark, and I set my narrow piece on the saw using the freshly cut edge of the wide board as my new fence. Now, some people will do this freehand, but I'm a wimp, so I use double-sided tape to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, and then I'll make my cut. Now, if I flip the narrow piece over, it'll match up perfectly to the wide piece, and I get a nice tight miter. Now, while this method will work no matter what, I want to show you a slightly different method that oftentimes gets suggested but doesn't necessarily work in every situation. Cut both boards to 120 degrees, lay the narrow board on top of the wide board, flush up the edge with the end, make a mark, connect the dots just like we did before. But this time, swap the two and go through all those same steps again. What you'll end up with is two boards with cut lines instead of one. Now you can ditch the clamps and the tape and just cut both boards until this happens. See, depending on the width and angle of the pieces that you're trying to miter, you may not be able to cut the narrow piece because your saw just won't be able to make that cut. As an example, these two pieces are mitered to fit the exact same 120-degree corner, and even though the narrow piece only has to be cut to 54 degrees, if I have a saw that only goes to 50, I just won't be able to make that cut. The first method works no matter what because you're using the wider board as a new fence, kind of manipulating the geometry of the cut. Now, speaking of those two pieces, it's important to mention that if you're using material that has a distinct face, since the narrow piece gets cut, we'll call it face down, you may have to set up a left side and or a right side operation depending on what you have going on. And one last thing, you might be wondering why I originally said to cut both boards to 120 degrees. Well, depending on the widths and angles that you're mitering, if the narrow piece isn't cut ahead of time, it may not fit into the miter saw all the way.